Grace and peace to you from Grace Church on the Hill in Toronto. These are strange and trying times for us all. I'm just here in the church trying to be still, be quiet, cultivate my inner life. We all have an inner life, and perhaps especially at times like this when we don't want to binge on Netflix anymore or watch sports or read a magazine about nothing. We need to turn inward, I think, because God is found inwardly, as well as in the beauty of a place like this. So it's a time to cultivate our inner resources and to feed and stimulate and nurture our inner life. One thing I've found myself doing in recent months is revisiting poetry, turning to familiar authors, the friendship I've enjoyed with them through the years, and letting them speak to me again. And some of the greatest, of course, are Christians. We forget that three of the greatest poets of the English world of the past century were Christians. Now, that doesn't make sense, does it? TS Eliot, of course, the great Nobel Prize-winning poet, dramatist, literary critic, author, editor, and critic of society, of course. And his younger friend, W.H. Auden, a very serious and devout Christian. And we forget also that rather hidden priest-poet of Wales, R.S. Thomas, who died in the year 2000. So the whole 20th century has been nurtured, I think, by the poetry in the English world, certainly by wonderful Christian artists. What I hope to do is just share with you a bit of my sense of who this man T.S. Eliot was, his life, his poetry. But this isn't a graduate seminar in English literature, and I'm not a literary scholar. I'm just a priest, a Christian looking to other Christians for sustenance in this pilgrimage we're in. And then as we approach this season of All Saints, we look to those who have walked this journey before us, and we ask them, how did they do this? We're beggars asking for bread on the journey. So I've been returning to the poetry and the life, which is very enthralling, of T.S. Eliot. A man who was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri, of all places, and ended his life in London, England, where he spent most of his adult life in 1965. So his life spans 2/3 of the 20th century. It's in living memory, and what he speaks about, even the things he spoke about 100 years ago in the 1920s, speak to us today. What do we say about poetry? We don't read it. What do we say about the Bible? We don't just read it, it reads us. And the same thing with great poetry. It reads us. It knows us. It speaks to us. And that's, for me, the appeal of Eliot's poetry. I want to just remind you that you probably know a lot more about T.S. Eliot than you might think. For instance, we picture him as a rather sober, solemn, proper American-turned Anglophile, British citizen with his brawly and his bowler, but actually he had a tremendous sense of fun. He was a comic in many ways. His friend Ezra Pound called him Possum. Possums play dead. They don't move. But inside there's a lot of life going on. Well, Pound called his young poetic friend Eliot Possum. And I'm going to read from Old Possum's book of Practical Cats. Many of us saw Andrew Lloyd Webber's hit musical Cats in the late 80s. Well, where did he get his libretto? From T.S. Eliot. Do you remember the Rum Tum Tugger? The rum-tum-tugger is a curious cat. If you offer him pheasant, he would rather have grouse. If you put him in a house, he would much prefer a flat. If you put him in a flat, then he'd rather have a house. If you set him on a mouse, then he only wants a rat. If you set him on a rat, then he'd rather chase a mouse. Yes, the rum-tum-tugger is a curious cat, and there isn't any call for me to shout it, for he will do as he do, and there's no doing anything about it. How about Macavity, the mystery cat? Macavity's a mystery cat. He's called the hidden paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair. For when they reach the scene of crime, Macavity's not there. Macavity, Macavity, there's no one like Macavity. He's broken every human law. He breaks the law of gravity. His powers of levitation could make a fakir stare, and when you reach the scene of crime, Macavity's not there. You may seek him in the basement. You may look up in the air. But I tell you once and once again, Macavity's not there. He had a sense of humor, a sense of the comical. This stayed Missouri Unitarian. Well, you know more about T.S. Eliot than you might think. How about the opening of his great poem that made his reputation, The Wasteland? Wrote it just after the First World War. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. April is the cruelest month. It's a very famous start. And The Wasteland speaks very much, I think, to issues of our own day. It was written, of course, in the aftermath, the collapse of Western civilization that resulted from the First World War, with 50 million people dead. The collapse of European civilization in France and Germany and England. The whole decline of a culture. The void, the desolation, the emptiness, the wasteland. Can that poem speak to us today in a world of declining empires, rising empires, competing ideologies, the loss of the democratic, demagogues here and there, fake news? You know the landscape as well as I do. The Wasteland is a symbolic modernist poem, a collage of fragments of this and that, and that's perhaps what most epitomizes Eliot's poetry. Fragments of this and that, pieces. You know, the way Picasso deconstructed, let's say, a guitar, or deconstructed the female form, bits and pieces here and there. Eliot deconstructs his poetry. And of course, he, along with James Joyce, are friends in this modernist project, putting together this collage, this juxtaposition of jagged parts. And what Eliot does, he's a poet of enormous erudition, is draw from the Italian quotes, German quotes, French quotes, Latin quotes, Sanskrit quotes, Hindu scriptures, Buddhist scriptures, ancient Greek. It's just an astonishing collage. And of course, it's a poem that needs footnotes just for us to try and make sense of it. But that was his first huge breakthrough to make his reputation as a young man. It's a kind of Jeremiah-like indictment of the emptiness, the shallowness, the void, the collapse, the wilderness aftermath of this Western culture. It's a vitriolic rebuke to the shallowness, the vulgarity, the distaste he feels about the moral shambles that post-war Europe finds itself in, the sterility of this culture. He sees it in many ways, and we see it later in his poetry, in need of a refining, purifying fire. Well, how about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock? Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau used to quote it. It's a 1917 poem. The war is still going on. And this is written by a young man, really about an old man. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon the table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. What does that mean? Cheap restaurants, sawdust, oyster shells. Let us go make a visit. Women talking about Michelangelo? This is a new form of poetry. And what does it mean? It means what it means. We read it, but it reads us. It evokes some response in us. That is its meaning. Can't you hear the older Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau? I grow old, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls, wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. What does that mean? It means what it means. This is why Eliot is such an astonishingly fresh voice in the post-war era. A few other quotes of Eliot, I'm sure, ring a bell. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. 1925, young man. The world that he knew has ended. Is our world ending with a bang or a whimper? How about this? Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Reality impinges on us, exposes us. So that's why we need to be distracted by whatever, so we don't feel the weight of reality, which I think is a synonym for, you know. How about this? The last temptation is the greatest treason. To do the right deed for the wrong reason. I think that's from his play Murder in the Cathedral about St. Thomas of Becket. To do the right deed for the wrong reason. How often have we done the right deed for the wrong reason? Our motivation wasn't right. Here's something from Choruses from the Rock, which he wrote in the 1930s. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? This is way before the information age or the internet. People then were still looking in the encyclopedia. What does this mean? Where is the knowledge we have lost in infinite access to information? This is something that the church in every age speaks about. Wisdom, knowledge, information. We need to make the distinction. How about this in his 4 quartets? What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. The end is where we start from. Do you mean something has to collapse and end before we can begin another chapter? What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. I think it's actually a very hopeful and optimistic statement. He made it, of course, about his baptism, about the end of one kind of life and identity and the beginning of a new identity, which he embraced in midlife. How about this? We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And know the place for the first time. Think about that. Think about your life, your journey, your childhood, your formation, your identity. How about this? Old men ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. We must be still and still moving into another intensity for a further union, a deeper communion through the dark cold and the empty desolation. The wave cry, the wind cry, the vast waters of the petrel and the porpoise. In the end is my beginning. It's encouraging. Old men ought to be explorers, moving. We must be still. Still. It's so hard to be still and still moving. Still and still moving. In my end is my beginning. Well, it reminds me of old Nicodemus in John's Gospel. Remember, he asked Jesus, how can an old man like me be born again? So Eliot is very much engaged in the idea of regeneration, rebirth, the end of a form of life, and the beginning of a new and fruitful journey. As he says, it's a hard journey, but he should be glad of another chance to make that journey. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this sample of T.S. Eliot's poetry. Next time, we'll talk about the formative influences that have shaped his life and moved him finally to the point of conversion to Christianity at the age of 39. Grace and peace to you from Grace Church on the Hill.